Imagine a nation just emerging from decades of really rigid state control, standing right on the edge of this massive shift.
Yeah, a society dreaming of, rapid transformation.
And part of that dream was that every adult citizen could become a shareholder, actually owning a piece of their country's future. It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And what we're diving into today is exactly that, a really pivotal moment, this huge experiment aimed at making that vision real.
Okay, let's unpack this then. This deep dive is into, well, one of the most ambitious, radical, and ultimately scandalous economic experiments of the 20th century, the voucher privatization program, launched in Czechoslovakia right after the 1989 Velvet Revolution.
That's right.
We've gone through a stack of your sources, articles, research papers, notes, trying to pull out the key nuggets for you.
And our mission really is to figure out how this grand experiment, which was, designed for speed and fairness, how it devolved into this massive, far-reaching scandal, defined by, systemic flaws, a real vacuum in regulation, and just rampant opportunism.
Ultimately betraying the trust of millions.
Millions.
Yeah.
So how it went so wrong, we really have to go back to the start. 1989, post-Velvet Revolution Czechoslovakia, they inherited an economy that was, arguably the most rigidly state-controlled in the entire Soviet bloc.
Really? More than others?
Oh, yeah. Extreme etatization, they called it. Only about 1.2% of the workforce was in the private sector, just 4% of GDP.
Wow.
And unlike, say, Hungary or Poland, where some small businesses kind of survived, in Czechoslovakia, even tiny mom-and-pop shops have been basically wiped out.
So virtually no private capital, no experience with markets.
Zero experience. None, which is a tough place to start a market economy.
That sounds like an almost impossible starting point. What was the immediate, fallout from that kind of situation?
Well, the economy just plummeted. A severe transformational recession, they termed it. The collapse of Communism, the Soviet trade bloc, hit them hard. Output dropped steeply.
And inflation.
Rampant inflation, yeah.
Plus,
So the liberalized prices. It was a pretty dire situation, honestly. It really demanded drastic measures.
So standard privatization methods were off the table, like selling companies off one by one.
Pretty much impossible. There just wasn't enough domestic savings to buy up all those huge state assets, and doing it slowly, piece by piece, seemed politically dangerous too.
Why dangerous?
The fear was that the old communist managers or elites would either sabotage the process or strip the assets while things were in limbo. The sheer scale of state ownership just forced them to think radically differently.
Okay, so dire straits, a clean slate in some ways. What kind of radical ideas started bubbling up? And who was pushing them?
This is where the whole shock therapy idea comes in. The big champion was the finance minister, Václav Klaus. Very influential figure.
Right, I've heard the name.
He pushed for an extremely rapid, comprehensive transition. The core belief was just speed above all else.
To stop the old guard.
Exactly. To prevent the nomenklatura, the state managers, from undermining reforms or grabbing assets, they genuinely thought a gradual approach would be a disaster.
And if speed is the absolute top priority, that implies something else wasn't the priority, right?
Absolutely. And this led to a really critical, fateful decision. The speed of privatization was prioritized over its quality and legality.
Quality and legality. Second place.
Way down the list.
Yeah.
Building a solid legal framework for capital markets, protecting shareholders, corporate governance stuff, that was seen as secondary. Too slow.
So they knew they were leaving gaps.
It wasn't an oversight. It was fundamental. They consciously decided, let's get the property out of state hands first. We'll write the proper rules later. It created this huge institutional vacuum.
A vacuum that someone was bound to fill.
Precisely. And this decision, it really shows a universal risk in rapid change, doesn't it? That vacuum becomes a breeding ground for exploitation. It undermined the very goals of fairness and trust they were supposedly aiming for.
Plus, Klaus didn't want foreigners buying everything up, right?
Right. He was strongly against selling the nation's family silver to foreign investors, which kind of reinforced the idea that this domestic voucher scheme was the only way to go, the only fair way.
Okay, so the stage is set for this massive, completely untested experiment. How exactly was it designed? What were the main pillars?
Well, there were three main pillars. First, you had restitution laws. These aimed to give back property that was nationalized after 1948 to the original owners or their heirs.
That must have been popular.
Politically very popular, yeah. And it did create a small initial private sector, small businesses, restaurants, that kind of thing.
Okay, pillar one. What's two?
Second was small-scale privatization. This started late 1990. It targeted smaller units, shops, services, workshops, mainly through public auctions.
And how did that go?
Actually, very successfully. Over 22,000 units were privatized by '92. It really helped reestablish small entrepreneurs. A definite plus.
And then the big one, Pillar 3, the centerpiece.
Right. The large-scale voucher privatization program, this was the truly unprecedented part.
How did it work mechanically?
Okay, so every adult citizen could buy a voucher book. It cost 1,000 crowns, which was maybe a third of an average monthly wage back then.
Okay, affordable.
Relatively. Inside the book were 1,000 investment points. These points had no initial cash value, they were just points.
And you use these points?
You use them to bid for shares in the big state-owned companies that were being privatized. This happened in sequential rounds, and the price in points for shares would adjust based on demand in each round.
Sounds complex for the average person.
It was. The stated goals, though, sounded great. Rapid wealth distribution, socially fair, create new entrepreneurs, build a capital market from scratch, all without needing huge domestic savings.
But like you said, grand plans often have these vulnerabilities.
Right.
Where was the fatal flaw here?
The government intentionally provided very little information. About the companies, about the process itself, they created this massive information asymmetry.
Why intentionally?
Again, speed, but also this idea, paternalistic, that citizens didn't need all the details. But it left a financially illiterate public, totally new to stocks and risk, completely in the dark.
So a handful of insiders knew what was going on, and everyone else?
Pretty much flying blind. And this wasn't just seen as economic policy, it was framed as a moral political project, turning citizens into capitalist subjects.
Which makes the betrayal even worse later on.
Exactly. When it went wrong, it felt like a profound violation of trust in the whole new democratic system.
So the theory sounds, well, interesting, but it crashes into reality pretty fast. What happened when millions of inexperienced people suddenly had these voucher points?
Yeah, the government's vision of, millions of citizens carefully studying balance sheets.
Yeah.
That just didn't happen.
Shocker.
Right. That information vacuum we talked about, it got filled incredibly quickly by the spontaneous emergence of these intermediaries. Over 400 investment privatization funds, or IPFs, just sprang up.
400?
Right.
Wow. And they promised to manage the points for people.
Exactly. They acted as the middlemen.
How did these brand new funds manage to grab so many of those points? People just handed them over?
Well, they used aggressive advertising. Something totally new in that post-communist world. Big campaigns making bold, often totally outlandish promises.
Like what?
Guaranteed high returns. Stuff like that. To a public that was confused, risk-averse, and didn't understand the process.
And it worked.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
In the first wave, 72%, nearly 3/4 of all the voucher points ended up with these IPFs.
So much for dispersed ownership.
Exactly the opposite. Massive ownership concentration in the hands of a few hundred unregulated fund managers. Not what was intended at all.
And it gets even weirder, right? Because a lot of the biggest IPFs were actually set up by banks that were still mostly owned by the state.
Yeah, that's the incredible paradox. Huge banks like Komerční banka, Česká spořitelna, still largely controlled by the National Property Fund, the state agency overseeing privatization, they set up the most dominant IPFs.
That sounds like a massive conflict of interest. The state selling assets to itself, almost.
It created what some called an incestuous loop. The state was basically transferring control of huge industrial companies to funds managed by banks it still owned.
I think I read a quote about that.
Yeah, one critic at the time called it a 5-year journey from public ownership to public ownership. It was just riddled with potential conflicts of interest. And it really paved the way for what came next.
This sounds like the perfect storm for some kind of new financial crime. And it even got its own specific name, didn't it?
It did indeed. Tunelovany. Tunneling.
Tunneling.
It became the signature crime of the era. And it's a vivid term, right? It describes siphoning assets and value out of a company for the benefit of the new controlling owners.
Leaving just an empty shell behind for the minority shareholders, like the people whose vouchers ended up there.
Exactly. And unlike, say, straightforward theft, tunneling often operated with this kind of veneer of legality. Using complex transactions, shell companies, it made it really hard for inexperienced police and prosecutors to tackle.
So how did they actually do it? What were the methods for tunneling these assets out?
They were quite creative, unfortunately. A common one was asset stripping, selling off the company's valuable stuff, real estate, factories, equipment to secret shell companies, often offshore, controlled by the fund managers at ridiculously low prices.
Okay, so sell the good stuff cheap to yourself. What else?
Fraudulent loans and transfer pricing were big. The company controlled by the fund would issue huge loans to other companies secretly controlled by the same people, with zero expectation of ever getting repaid.
It's just giving money away.
Essentially. Or they'd lock the company into terrible contracts, buying supplies from related companies at inflated prices, or selling the company's products at massive discounts to insiders, siphoning value that way.
And the others.
And then there was just outright looting, especially using bank connections. Companies linked to these funds, especially those connected to the still state-influenced banks, could borrow huge amounts of money with no real intention of repaying. They'd load the company up with debt for their own private benefit.
The consequences must have been absolutely devastating for the companies, the economy.
Oh, absolutely devastating. And what's really key here is that the sheer scale of this tunneling just exposed how unprepared the legal system was.
Right. You mentioned the lack of rules earlier.
The Commercial Code from 1991 was completely outdated for this. Minority shareholders had almost no rights or legal ways to fight back. Bankruptcy laws were incredibly weak. A company could be systematically stripped for years before anything happened.
So it wasn't just a few bad apples.
No, it was systemic. The rules of the game were either missing or easily bent. This allowed so many potentially valuable companies, the industrial jewels of the country, to be just hollowed out. Capital fled abroad, companies collapsed.
Leading to job losses and those voucher points becoming worthless for ordinary people.
Exactly. A total disaster for many.
Now, a really crucial turn in this story happens in 1993 with the Velvet Divorce Czechoslovakia splitting peacefully into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. This led to quite different paths for privatization, didn't it? Each with its own flavor of scandal.
Absolutely. That split is key. The Czech Republic, led by Václav Klaus, actually pushed ahead with a second wave of voucher privatization.
Doubling down.
Pretty much. And unfortunately, it just amplified the existing problems, more tunneling, weak governance continuing. It was basically a flawed market mechanism being exploited to the max.
And Slovakia, what happened there?
Slovakia took a totally different route under its new Prime Minister Vladimír Mečiar, who was much more autocratic. He abruptly canceled the voucher program entirely.
I canceled it, so what did they do instead?
His government switched to really opaque direct sales of state property. But these weren't open market sales. They were sold at massive discounts, often to politically connected insiders, his allies.
So not a flawed market, but state-directed cronyism.
Exactly. It wasn't about market mechanisms failing. It was a deliberate, state-led project to create a loyal business oligarchy that would support his rule. Crony capitalism by design.
And what was the impact of that radically different approach on Slovakia's economy and reputation?
It was disastrous in its own way. It completely destroyed investor confidence, both domestic and foreign. The capital market became totally illiquid. Foreign direct investment just dried up, largely bypassing Slovakia for years.
I remember hearing a description.
Yeah, it gained this terrible international reputation. Madeleine Albright famously called it a black hole in the heart of Europe during that period. International isolation was a major consequence.
Okay, so amidst all this chaos, this sort of predatory environment emerging in both countries, one figure really stands out. He became almost the archetype of the new opportunist, a kind of microcosm of the whole scandal. Viktor Kožený, the pirate of Prague.
Ah, yes, Kožený. He's quite the character. He returned to Czechoslovakia in 1990. He actually had a Harvard economics degree.
Really? Harvard?
Yep. And he had this brilliant, intuitive grasp of branding and marketing. He apparently started with just a couple of $1,000s.
What did he do?
In October 1990, he founded Harvard Capital and Consulting, HC&C.
Harvard Capital and Consulting. That name was deliberate, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely a masterstroke of marketing. He explicitly chose the name to trade on Harvard University's global prestige. It gave him instant credibility, an aura of respectability.
Even though Harvard itself wasn't happy about it?
Harvard publicly disavowed him, trying to get him to stop using the name, but it didn't matter. To a naive public, desperate for trustworthy guidance, that Harvard tag was invaluable. Pure marketing gold.
So he had the branding. How did he actually attract investors, attract those voucher points? I understand he made a pretty audacious promise.
Audacious is putting it mildly. It was pure genius in understanding mass psychology, really. By late 1991, public enthusiasm for the whole voucher scheme was actually fading. It seemed too complex, too uncertain. The government was worried not enough people would participate. So Kožený launches this unprecedented, nationwide advertising blitz. Billboards, TV ads, everything. And the core message was Jistota desetinásobku.
Which means?
The certainty of a tenfold return. He personally guaranteed that for every 1,000 crown voucher book entrusted to his Harvard funds, he would pay back 10,000 crowns after 1 year and 1 day.
10 times your money back, guarantees. How could he possibly guarantee that?
He couldn't. He admitted later it was basically a Ponzi scheme. He had absolutely no idea how he'd pay out if everyone actually demanded their money at once.
But it worked. People bought it.
Spectacularly effective. An estimated 800,000 Czechs and Slovaks handed over their voucher books to HC&C.
800,000 people.
Yeah. It made his funds among the largest players overnight. He controlled something like 11% of all the voucher points. And ironically, his crazy promise probably saved the government's flagship program by massively boosting participation. It jumped from maybe 30% expected to over 75%.
So he single-handedly drove participation with a promise he couldn't keep. Having amassed all this control, what did the Pirate of Prague do next? Did he try to build businesses?
Not a chance. Any pretense of long-term investment vanished almost immediately. His goal was simple: extract cash as fast as possible.
Tunneling again.
Textbook tunneling on a massive scale. He and his associates apparently executed over 1,000 transactions, specifically designed to siphon assets out of the companies his Harvard funds now controlled.
1,000 transactions. How? Same methods. Asset stripping.
Yep. Selling off valuable assets on the cheap to offshore shell companies he controlled. Siphoning cash through incredibly complex trades between his various funds and other entities he set up. Transferring the money out, mainly to the Bahamas, other tax havens.
I mean, the investors. The 800,000 people who trusted the Harvard name and the tenfold promise. What happened to their investment?
Absolute catastrophe for them. The underlying industrial companies HC&C controlled were crippled by the asset stripping. The value of the Harvard funds themselves just plummeted. Estimates are by around 80%.
So the certainty of a tenfold return just evaporated.
Completely. It left those 800,000 investors holding virtually worthless paper certificates. Just paper.
While Kožený.
Meanwhile, Kožený's personal fortune ballooned. Estimates range from $200 million up to maybe $700 million. And as the Czech authorities slowly started to piece things together and investigate, Kožený fled the country in 1994.
To the Bahamas. Yeah.
Where he bought lavish properties and earned his enduring nickname, the Pirate of Prague.
The scale of this aftermath sounds just immense. How do you even begin to quantify the total damage from all this privatization, chaos, the tunneling, the Kožený affair?
It's incredibly difficult to get a precise number, obviously. But the figures thrown around are staggering. Back in 2001, the Czech Ministry of Finance put out an estimate. They figured fraudulent activities, mostly the tunneling and the resulting bankruptcies, cost the Czech economy something like 700 billion crowns.
700 billion? What was that in dollars back then?
At the time, that was roughly $35 billion. A colossal amount of money for an economy that size.
And it was basically a wealth transfer.
A massive, uncompensated wealth transfer from the public, from the state, ultimately from ordinary citizens, into the pockets of a relatively small group of these opportunistic financiers and insiders.
And the state itself ended up paying a price too, didn't it? Not just losing the assets.
Oh, absolutely. The state became a huge secondary victim. Firstly, all those hollowed out companies that went bankrupt meant lost jobs, a smaller tax base, bad for the economy.
But also the banks.
More significantly, yes. The state was eventually forced to bail out several major banks that were teetering on the brink of collapse. Why? Because they were saddled with enormous amounts of non-performing loans made to these tunneled companies that were never going to be repaid.
So taxpayers ended up footing the bill.
Taxpayers effectively footed the bill for a crisis that was enabled, at least in part, by the government's own poorly designed, poorly regulated privatization policies. A bitter irony.
And it sounds like the police, the courts, the whole legal system were just completely unprepared for this kind of sophisticated financial crime.
Totally overwhelmed. You have to remember, in the early 90s, police, prosecutors, judges, they had almost zero experience with complex financial fraud.
They were used to different kinds of crime.
Exactly. They were used to the criminal code of a totalitarian state: theft, assault, maybe basic embezzlement. Not the nuances of securities law, transfer pricing, offshore shell companies. Plus, they had severe staff shortages. Some prosecution offices, courts, were reportedly running at like 15% capacity.
15%?
Yeah. And the basic law, that 1991 commercial code, was just not up to the task. It lacked strong protections for minority shareholders, didn't mandate proper disclosure. It was full of holes.
So with the system struggling, what finally pushed them towards meaningful reform? Was it internal pressure building up or something else?
It was largely external pressure, actually. The single biggest catalyst for change for both the Czech Republic and Slovakia was the prospect of joining the European Union.
The EU accession process.
Exactly. Both countries applied in 1995. And the need to align their national laws with EU standards, especially around market regulation, corporate governance, financial crime, that forced their governments to finally adopt the modern regulations they'd neglected for years.
So the EU carrot and stick worked.
It was incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
In the Czech Republic, you saw a key amendment to the Commercial Code in '96 to strengthen shareholder rights. Then, crucially, an independent securities commission was set up in 1998 with real enforcement powers.
And Slovakia, was it slower there because of Mečiar?
Yes, progress completely stalled during the Mečiar era. Substantive reforms really only began after a more pro-Western government came to power in 1998, specifically prioritizing getting into the EU and NATO.
Okay, so reforms eventually came, driven by the EU. But what about justice for the biggest players? What happened to Viktor Kožený, the pirate himself? Did he ever face consequences?
Well, his story really highlights just how difficult transnational justice can be, especially when huge amounts of money are involved. After he fled to the Bahamas in '94, he used his fortune and, frankly, the complexities of international law to evade accountability for decades.
So the Czechs tried to get him?
Oh, yes. In the Czech Republic, he was eventually tried in absentia, found guilty of massive fraud in Chile 10, sentenced to 10 years in prison, ordered to pay hundreds of millions in damages. The verdict was upheld on appeal in 2012.
But unenforceable.
Completely unenforceable while he remained in the Bahamas, which has no extradition treaty covering that specific conviction.
But the U.S. went after him too, didn't they? For something else.
Yes, that's right. The U.S. indicted him in 2003 for a different scheme, arguably even more audacious, that happened later. It involved allegedly bribing top officials in Azerbaijan to gain control during the privatization of their state oil company, SOCAR.
Defrauding American investors in that deal.
Exactly. Defrauding wealthy American investors who he brought into the deal. His American partner in that, Frederick Bork, was actually convicted in New York in 2009 and went to prison.
But Kožený himself?
Kožený was arrested in the Bahamas based on the U.S. indictment, and he was actually held there from 2005 to 2007 fighting extradition. But he eventually won. He successfully argued against extradition through the Bahamian courts.
And the final appeal?
The final U.S. appeal to the Privy Council in London, which is the highest court for some Commonwealth countries like the Bahamas, was denied in 2012. So he won. He remains effectively confined to his luxury compound in the Bahamas, unable to travel much, but technically a free man, never served a day for any of it.
Wow. So looking back at this whole saga, beyond the billions lost, beyond Kožený sunning himself in the Bahamas, what's the real long shadow? What's the lasting impact on these societies today?
I think the most profound, the deepest damage, was really the decimation of public trust. For millions of ordinary Czechs and Slovaks, this voucher program was pitched as, national renewal, fairness, empowerment.
Citizen capitalism.
Exactly. And instead, for so many, it just became proof that the whole new system was a rigged game. It created this deep, deep cynicism.
And not just about finance?
No, it went much further. It corroded faith in the state itself, in the justice systems that couldn't or wouldn't prosecute effectively, in the political class that oversaw it all. This feeling that ordinary people were put in this incredibly unfair position while a small group of insiders just walked away with the nation's wealth. That fueled this long-term deficit of trust in democratic institutions.
Creating fertile ground for other kinds of politics.
Absolutely. Fertile ground for populist movements that thrive on that sense of betrayal and disillusionment.
And instead of creating this broad class of small entrepreneurs they talked about, it actually did the opposite.
It really did. It spectacularly failed in that original goal. Instead, it led directly to the creation of a new, highly concentrated oligarchy.
They're tunneling in the Czech case.
And through those crony direct sales in Slovakia under Mečiar. This new economic elite then very quickly learned how to translate their wealth into political influence.
Leading to state capture.
Leading to systems of political economic interdependence, state capture, where policies favor the connected few. It fostered a culture of systemic corruption that really outlasts the privatization era itself. You can still see echoes of it today in things like manipulating public procurement contracts.
It's fascinating, though, how their economic paths diverged afterwards, despite the shared trauma and similar starting points.
It is. The Czech Republic, after a really turbulent 90s, did eventually stabilize. They reformed their capital markets, largely thanks to that EU pressure, and became a relatively prosperous, integrated European market economy, though still grappling with the scandal's legacy of distrust.
And Slovakia?
Slovakia's path was maybe more dramatic. The Mečiar years really left it stagnant and isolated. But the post-1998 reforms, again driven by the EU goal, led to very rapid economic growth, the Tiger period, and eventually they even adopted the euro.
And maybe the biggest paradox, the most surprising thing, is that despite all this upheaval, this massive perceived transfer of wealth, both countries actually maintain some of the lowest levels of income inequality in the post-communist world.
That's absolutely true, and it's often pointed out, largely thanks to pretty resilient social welfare systems that cushion the blow for many. But, and this is crucial, that focus on income inequality kind of masks the deeper public feeling.
Which is about
the unjust distribution of wealth, not just income. The feeling wasn't just some people got richer, it was our collective national assets, the family silver, were unfairly given away or stolen. That perception of fundamental unfairness in how the nation's wealth was handled creates this lasting sense of grievance that still shapes debates about justice, fairness, and the real meaning of the post-communist transition, even today.
So it's a journey from this almost utopian dream of citizen shareholders owning their country to a really shocking reality of widespread fraud, systemic failure, and profoundly betrayed trust. The Czech and Slovak privatization story is just a powerful, maybe cautionary tale about transformation.
It really is. And as you reflect on this huge, unprecedented experiment, maybe consider this. What really makes for a successful transformation from one system to another? Is it just about the economic numbers?
Yeah.
GDP growth?
Or is it something deeper?
Or is it also fundamentally about the trust and the faith of the people in the basic fairness of the process itself? How much does that trust matter in the long run?
Definitely something to think about. We encourage you to keep exploring these complex stories of economic transition and the enduring, absolutely critical importance of trust and strong, reliable institutions.